This is going to be a short video analysis about the Aries Ingress chart. This is the chart from a couple days ago, March 20th, 2026. Every year, the sun enters Aries and reaches the 0 degree mark, which in turn, astrologers have taken the chart of that moment as the chart for the rest of the entire zodiacal year. So here you can see the sun just ingressed in a conjunction to Neptune at 1 degree of Aries. Also applying to a sextile to Pluto here at 5 degrees of Aquarius. So this dynamic with all three planets here could be understood as deceptiveness from leaders, which certainly isn't a new thing, but it's all the more pronounced in this chart for the year. Uh, Pluto is that hidden force that is driving leaders to enact powers by any means necessary in order to gain control. And then Neptune is essentially the smoke screen, the illusion that is weaved to convince people uh, to justify, you know, actions as noble or liberating, or as we're seeing, having to do with a spiritual or religious cause. A lot of what I'm saying has already begun even prior to this Aries ingress, but it's all the more a theme that's essentially just baked into the rest of this zodiacal year as well. So Neptune also signifies the eroding or dissolving of certain solar figures. I mean, you know, sure, if you follow world events, news, certain people come to mind. Um, so this is essentially self-deception, self-destruction as this cult of personalities that we've seen for the last decade or so begins to fade. And then the presence of Saturn in Aries which is the reality principle, is implying the consequences of previous actions of solar figures, of egos that have acted out of control. Uh, yeah, leadership that's gone astray, that's been self-serving. Uh, so even though Saturn's weakened, it still brings its significations of consequence to the individual, even if the sun is really strong right now in its exaltation sign. Sun Neptune, as we are already seeing in some places, is also indicative of leadership without a clear plan or direction. So that's I'd say certainly the case right now with what's happening in Iran, or well, Israel, Iran, United States, the whole conflict essentially. It seems like it wasn't really as thought out as one would think it would be. So that may just be the indications Neptune is that we're seeing of Neptune and the sun. Um, that will continue to possibly be something we see in further events this year. So this is just the first of many of these kind of not very well thought out, kind of illusory, impulsive actions that then have heavy consequences, which Saturn is going to deliver as well. Um, so the sun, even though it's exalted, it's being weighed down somewhat here, though it's still very powerful, and it's the sun's still calling the shots. So it's still going to have a lot to say and a lot of the final word in this. And I don't just mean governments, it can mean even in interpersonal dynamics. But since we are looking at mundane astrology, I'm essentially referring to world leaders when I refer to the sun. For the moon, which is at 20 degrees Aries, here near the end of the sign, it's separating from a square to Jupiter here at 15 degrees, which is her own sign, so receiving Jupiter. So this is somewhat optimistic. The general mood, at least, even though it's challenging, there is some optimism to this configuration. The moon, however, is not going to, or well, this is, I'm already speaking of the past. The moon didn't complete another aspect before moving into Taurus, so that is what's called a void of course moon. Um, so there's really nothing much to it. There's no real influence. The moon is essentially uh, kind of powerless at that point. It's not receiving or emitting any influences. Um, Significations, right? When I say influences, I'm not being literal about that, but I'm just saying in terms of the way we read astrology, in terms of the significations that are implied by different configurations. So there's nothing more really with the moon. It's not very active aside from that aspect. Though being in Aries, that is a signification, an indicator of anger in the collective. You know, since Aries is a sign associated with anger, with rage, you know, righteous anger, you know, in many cases, as is called for and should be called for now. Uh, and also very much of it just individualism, a personal sense, well, a sense of individualism which obviously is personal, but I think that's going to be the kind of the mood of a kind of in a sense of every man for himself. That's kind of going to be, I think, a major sentiment. That's not to say there won't be community or cooperation, but uh, the moon is thoughts, emotions, so a very strong sense of individualism seems to be, well, very much pronounced for the year here with the moon in Aries. Venus here at 17 degrees Aries. It's separating from a square to Jupiter, you know, the same square from the moon right here. Uh, so this is pretty much just disagreements being set aside here in consideration of what actually is important, like what the true issues that are at hand are, you know, like not, maybe putting aside pettiness and just coming to terms with really the hour we're at, what's actually important, what's actually of value, what values are actually mutually shared. You know, Venus is all about the values that we share in a society as individuals and just as people, you know, etiquette, the way we behave in public or the way we interact with other people. So, you know, hopefully it's showing that will be the case, that people will put aside a lot of the divisions and you know, the Venus has fallen. Maybe there's hope here for a little bit of unity to begin to form, putting aside the petty divisions that are, you know, manufactured in order to manipulate, you know, the divide and conquer. It's the oldest trick in the book, but it always works. So hopefully this will be a beginning of a change to that. Venus being in her fall, though, isn't really in the mood here for diplomacy or negotiating. There is a bit of a sense more of just fighting for survival. Um, it's very much speaking to conflictual environments. So, you know, pretty much anywhere you go in the world, there'll probably be some kind of conflicts, you know, to greater or lesser extents. So certainly seek out places in the world where conflict will be much less or better contained, or less severe, right? That's it's still going to spread on some level, and it's partly related to the financial struggles that are just kind of as a chain going to affect the whole world. Uh, which then brings us to Mercury, which is stationing direct at 8 degrees of Pisces. That's more positive than being retrograde, certainly. Though I think we're still kind of feeling the effects of that. Um, Being in detriment and fall, there's still this kind of sense of slowness, a slowness of processing information. I mean, myself even just today, trying to organize myself to write, I've felt that myself. So I don't know if other people probably are feeling that still. Mercury direct, but in Pisces, it's difficult maybe to communicate as well or to be clear in one's mind. Um, the difficulties also of discerning what is true and false, what's real, what's illusory, which of course isn't something that's just going to be dealt with this year, but here moving forward, uh, that's that's definitely going to be a problem that everybody's going to have to confront. And then also a lack at least of a sense of progress or of learning, maybe feeling kind of stuck in a loop, right? So kind of a stagnancy. Uh, Mercury also ruling commerce. This is kind of going back to my point with Venus and finances. Uh, Being conjunct Rahu, at the North Node, could also mean that there's a higher demand for goods that can be supplied, and this will be especially the case if trade routes continue to be blocked. Like right now, different sea routes, particularly of course with petroleum. The Strait of Hormuz, um, and just a lot of other trade routes, perhaps. The war and other conflicts that may start up are going to cause problems with trade and getting goods shipped, across continents. So we'll see how that goes, but that's likely going to be an issue. So, we'll probably see a shortage of products. Uh, so, maybe stock up now while things are still available, because who knows a few months from now where things will be at. Um, you know, just thinking back 6 years ago, you know, the reality that maybe nobody really thought could be a reality kicked in. So, it's not a novelty or a first time for shelves to be empty. So it's very likely that might start to be something that people see all around the world. So just something to keep in mind now. For Mars is especially important because in every Ingress chart, the position of Mars, being the ruler of the exalted sun, is going to be very key. Uh, so this year, Mars is at 14 degrees of Pisces. It's just separating from a conjunction to Rahu, which is at 8 degrees. So a positive aspect is the applying trine to its host Jupiter here, just 1 degree off, which is exact actually now as I'm recording this. This is a very supportive aspect to the cause that Mars is undertaking, which you could understand, or at least I understand it is this war that's being waged on the spiritual realm. We're in the middle of a major spiritual war, and of course have been for some time, a very long time. But especially now, I think it's becoming a little bit more visible. The invisible is becoming a little bit more visible as the veil has perhaps thinned a bit. Uh, so this is in the aftermath of its contact with Rahu, which always augments and increases things. So Mars in Pisces is indicative of also secret or undercover warfare, so covert operations, but also of invisible enemies. And what I mean by that is there have been documentations, on video of soldiers meeting ghost attackers. So essentially, spirits, jinn, demons, whatever you want to call them, invisible entities. They're actually attacking people, soldiers, or on battlefields, or possibly even beyond that into other spaces. But I think that that's definitely going to be something that's going to be much more talked about and much more experienced. People experiencing coming into contact with supernatural forces, uh, yeah, aggressive spiritual forces. So what I mean, but it's not at all benign forces, but very, very malefic forces that are being unleashed. So that's Mars and Pisces. So for Jupiter, there's the contact with Mars as well that I just mentioned. With the trine to Pisces, it's indicative, like I said, of the phenomenon uh, of the spiritual fight becoming more widespread. 'Cause Jupiter expands and increases things, so that's part of what I was saying with Mars there. This is Jupiter in trine to Mars in Pisces, which it rules. Is so it has Jupiter has the domain over Pisces, over the spiritual realm there. Um, this is essentially going to become spread as a more wide phenomenon, more growing awareness too, of also the need to protect oneself from malefic spirits. Uh, and then the downside is also of religious radicalization expanding, as we're already seeing. Uh, so it's clear that, fighting a war for a religious cause is already very well ingrained here into this chart for the year. Uh, yeah, a lot of this I know isn't new, and it's not surprising. I mean, one doesn't even necessarily need astrology to see these things or to know that they're likely to come to pass. But this is the astrology, and so it's for me, it's just a further confirmation of it. And Saturn here must be interpreted in its conjunction with Neptune, Saturn, Neptune, because neither one is really itself. No, Neptune isn't really Neptune, and Saturn isn't really Saturn when they're conjunct. They they inevitably form a third blended force, you could say, or archetype. Uh, so at 4 degrees, Saturn here is, well, it's engaging already with a sextile here to Pluto. I will say, just so that's still not quite perfected. So um, there's going to be a power struggle, authority, the status quo, all being very much challenged, and Saturn is weak. But so going off of that, essentially, it seems that boundaries are going to be very difficult to establish and enforce with this particularly weak Saturn, because everything that Saturn attempts to solidify, Neptune dissolves and blurs the line. So, and then, well, how Pluto comes into the mix is difficult to say at the moment, but Pluto always has to do with power and the excess and abuse of power. In this case, upon the individual Aries from the collective. So, that could even mean the collective turning on the individual, though I really see the individual or individualism becoming very much prominent, especially with the moon in Aries, as I mentioned earlier. Uh, It's still kind of early to tell, so I don't want to say too much in regards to Pluto because Pluto is a key player, but it's still very quiet, I think, at this point. Uh, once Uranus activates in Gemini, I think that then Pluto will come into the picture a little bit more so. Once it makes contact, in the air trine to Gemini. But returning to Saturn, we can certainly expect more challenges in regards to institutions and traditional modes of society, the way things operate, especially in ways that that affect the individual directly. So I know that's vague, but institutions is kind of a wide array of different things. But yeah, the traditional structures that we've known pretty much our whole lives is what I mean by that. So what I mean by traditional, I don't mean conservative necessarily, though Saturn does represent conservatism. But it's the traditions and just the ways that we've been accustomed to operate in society. Uh, of course, institutions are losing credibility and essentially are being dissolved and probably will be by the end of the Neptune and Aries transit, or by the end of Saturn's transit as well, even maybe. Um, but that's beyond the scope of this chart, which is only for 2026. As I said, Uranus and Pluto applying in this trine, which will go exact later in the year. I believe the exact trine is July 17th, 2026. Uh, so it's more or less going to activate the technocratic state imposing their agenda, via technology into the everyday functions of citizens, which is no secret and already is reality in some places. So, China, for example. But that's going to spread into the West more. So, American citizens, European citizens that maybe haven't quite ever experienced anything quite like that. That's it's what's coming. So it's important to consider how one's going to deal with that, what one's willing to compromise, and what one is not willing to compromise in. So this is just, indicative of the forceful attempts to impose greater control over society, essentially making AI a part of everyday life and much more difficult and inescapable of a reality for most people. But there's also the flip side, which I really want to emphasize here, which is the resistance movement that's going to be forming and organizing in what I would say are micro communities. Uh, yeah, people that are just not going to put up with that. I'm one of those people. Finding your own little corner of the earth to, live your life and be as self-sufficient as possible. If you can find other like-minded people to do it, all the better. Um, and that is going to be a trend because I think there's a fairly large number of people that are not going to conform to the mainstream and that already are acting on it. So this isn't like something that's just way off in the future. It's already here, but it's just, a matter of it becoming more widespread and more people getting on board with it, and just, taking action, uh, because there's really no time to sit around and fence it at this point. Um, the trine is, speaking of the Uranus-Pluto trine, that's still not fully active, but it will be. Uranus is still here out of sign at 28 Taurus. It's applying to the trine of Pluto at 5 degrees of Aquarius. So when Uranus reaches 5 degrees Gemini, I said on July 17th, I think that's the degree that it takes place at. Um, then that's when that's going to be more strongly felt. So it's not one-sided though. So the technocrats have not won. So one shouldn't believe that, and one shouldn't carry that mental image. One shouldn't project that's just what is, and it's inevitable. I mean, for a lot of people, it probably is because they haven't awakened to the situation, and by the time they do, it'll probably be too late. But for people who are aware of what is happening, what has been happening, and like I said, what is and what is coming, it's certainly not too late to act at this point still. Uh, and I think there's more people that are awake to the reality than maybe anyone realizes. So, we shall see. But, they haven't won, and Pluto empowers Uranus both as the oppressor, but also as the force of liberation. So, it's not one way or another. It's just energy that's there. That certainly the technocrats are going to utilize it to oppress and to try to impose their rule. But Uranus is also the liberator, the rebel, the emancipator. So it's a double-edged sword that we can equally use against them. So that's like I said, time will tell. That's the astrology. So take it or leave it, but at the very least, please consider it. So that's my analysis on the Aries Ingress chart. I hope you find it of value on how you choose to go about your year. So, with nothing else to say, as above, so below, as within, as without.